Dear friends and family back home, I've been thinking about all the things we used to do together. All the little moments that I didn't realize meant so much to me. Our conversations, struggles, and adventures that gave me so much joy and showed me who I wanted to become. Someone with a love of honor and bravery in the face of fear, not just for my friends, but anyone in need. I knew even then that God gave me a desire to protect, to shield those who are oppressed and fight back against evil. And I feel like now I am doing what I was meant to do. I don't regret that I might need to lay down my life for this cause, because I am doing it so that you can continue to live in peace. And I am honored to serve alongside my brothers and sisters in arms who have given me hope day after day when things have felt so dark. And even though I don't know what will happen tomorrow, I trust that God has a plan for me and my service to this country. I know you're worried, but if something happens to me, you must remember this. My death will not be the end of my life. It will endure into heaven, because the same God who inspired me to defend others carried out the ultimate act of love by dying for my salvation. And I know that whether I return to you safely or find peace in the arms of Christ above, I will have served honorably. Thank you so much for your love and your remembrance. It means more to me than I can say. I love you, and I'll see you soon.
With the mic? Good? Good? Okay. So we continue our walk through the book of Genesis this morning. The title for our series is Genesis, Roots of Our Redemption. And so far, we've seen on a few occasions how the beginning of God's salvific work in the world began at the beginning. Sin and salvation and promises have kind of been the overarching themes through Genesis so far. And those themes are going to continue for today as well. So whether we are reading stories of the first people who lived, or those who lived before writing was a thing, or those who billions look to as the founder of their faith, all of these that we read of in Genesis, they are in the same exact situation that all of us are in today, that all of humanity has been in. Sin has so corrupted and destroyed God's perfect creation that God had to work to bring an end to the separation that sin made between Him and His creation. And so from very early on, from the time of Adam and Eve, we see that the promise of sin's destruction is one that has been given hope. It's been given as comfort, and it provides peace to us for thousands of years, because one day sin will be destroyed. And even then, in the face of something as terrible as death, we can see that death as the fulfillment of God's promise to save us and finally completely restore us to the relationship with God the Father that He wants us to have, that so many of us have longed for and sought. So it's been a dark couple of chapters lately. Last week I spoke about the call of a father to sacrifice his son of promise, to offer him up to God. And it was all done as a test to see how faithful Abraham was to God's call and not to his own way of thinking and acting. Abraham passed the test, not because he sacrificed his child, but because God saw that he was now not withholding anything from him. But here's the thing. The fact that God was even calling for Isaac's life is no different from what he calls from any of us. You see, God expects our lives as payment for this sin that has so corrupted his creation. But even our lives, even the lives of every person who has ever lived, that is not enough to settle the debt, to pay the penalty that was owed to God for the sin in our lives. And so just as God sent a lamb to rescue Isaac from God's wrath, so he sends us the lamb to save us from our sin, to save us from sin's penalty, and to save us from God's wrath. And so what do we do? How do we follow up a story as dramatic as Abraham sacrificing Isaac like last week? How about we talk about something that many people are not comfortable talking about, and that's death. And more specifically, death of a loved one. What does the death of Abraham's wife teach us about God and our need to trust in him? So I invite you to join with me in Genesis 23. We're going to read through the chapter and see how God calls us to trust him even through our pain, to trust him for our provisions, and to trust in his promises. So if you have your Bibles, Genesis 23, please. Verse 1. Now Sarah lived 127 years. These were all the years of her life. For all of you Bible trivia nerds, Sarah is the only woman in the Bible whose age is given at the time of her death. So if you're watching Jeopardy and the Bible category comes up and they're like, only woman whose age is given at the time of her death, you can be like, who is Sarah? And people will look at you like, man, you're smart. So what this really shows, though, is that Sarah was highly regarded, not just by her husband, but by whoever wrote the book of Genesis many, many, many generations later. She was still highly regarded. Okay, verse 2. Sarah died in Kiriath Arba, that is Hebron, in the land of Canaan. And Abraham went in to mourn for Sarah and to weep. Now you might notice the construction there of these two phrases. Abraham went in to mourn and to weep. Typically these words, when they are combined, mourn and weep, it's done so to indicate that this is the death of a loved one who obviously has passed. The use of the two terms together shows that Abraham was not just weeping aloud, but that he carried out all of the other traditional customs of weeping and mourning. At this time, it was customary, if somebody was that distraught over the death of their loved one, they would rend their garments, they would tear their clothes, their hair would be all disheveled. He would start cutting his beard and throwing dust or dirt on his head, and he would begin fasting. These were the rites, and all of this would happen right in front of the corpse. Like this was the customary thing to do. And so that's why you read then that it says that Abraham came in, he went into the tent. And to the part where Sarah was lying. And then we hear a little bit that he rose up from before his dead wife. But this act of mourning the death of a loved one, it's still very different even today in the Middle East compared to what we do here. If you've ever seen the videos of someone who, whether it was an Arab person or a Hebrew person in Middle East that's killed, you see a funeral procession that is very, very different from our own. And it's accepted to be much more expressive in your mourning. In places like China, other Asian countries, Egypt, you can even hire professional mourners who their job is to really put on a show. Like it's always women who serve in this way. but you hire them, and what they will do is come to the funeral. They would be a part of the funeral procession, and they're the loudest ones. Like they're louder than even the mothers of a child, that was caught in a crossfire or something like that. That practice of hiring professional mourners, it's even in the Bible. In some of the prophets in the Old Testament, you read how these calls are being put out to the mourning women in order to show how sorrowful and distressing things had become in their nation. We read I think it was in Jeremiah, where he talks about how they were to, now is the time to call in the women of mourning, so that because Israel was in such a bad state. And it was a way also kind of flaunting your wealth, because it was, if you had enough money, you wanted to be able to show people just how upset the whole community should be at the passing of this loved one. So you would spend all kinds of money to hire all these people to make a big scene, so that people would say, wow, this must have been a loved person or somebody of great importance. All right, verse 3. When Abraham got up from beside his dead wife, he spoke to the Hittites. I am an alien residing among you. Give me burial property among you so that I can bury my dead. The Hittites replied to Abraham, listen to us, my lord. You are a prince of God among us. Bury your dead in our finest burial place. None of us will withhold from you his burial place for burying your dead. So what does this have to do with us today? Abraham's wife, Sarah, she's just passed away. His loved one is gone from this life. And you can see that even though he would do dumb things like lie about who she really was and say that she wasn't his wife, you get a sense from this passage that he really did love her. But to get a fuller sense of what all of this means today, we need to finish reading the chapter, and then I'll come back to these different passages. So to continue, verse 7. Then Abraham rose and bowed down to the Hittites, the people of the land. He said to them, if you are willing for me to bury my dead, listen to me and ask Ephron, son of Zohar, on my behalf, to give me the cave of Machpelah that belongs to him. It is at the end of his field. Let him give it to me in your presence for the full price as burial property. Ephron was sitting among the Hittites. In the hearing of all the Hittites who came to the gate of his city, Ephron the Hittite answered Abraham, no, my lord, listen to me. I give you the field. I give you the cave that is in it. I give it to you in the sight of my people. Bury your dead. Abraham bowed down to the people of the land and said to Ephron in the hearing of the people of the land, listen to me. If you please, let me pay the price of the field. Accept it from me and let me bury my dead there. Ephron answered Abraham and said to him, my lord, listen to me. Land worth 400 shekels of silver, what is that between you and me? Bury your dead. Abraham agreed with Ephron, and Abraham weighed out to Ephron the silver that he had agreed to in the hearing of the Hittites, 400 standard shekels of silver. So Ephron's field at near Mamre, the field with its cave and all the trees anywhere within the boundaries of the field became Abraham's possession in the sight of all the Hittites who came to the gate of his city. After this, Abraham buried his wife Sarah in the cave of the field at Machpelah near Mamre, that is Hebron, in the land of Canaan. The field with its cave passed from the Hittites to Abraham as burial property. All right, so after reading the whole story, I want to point out how through all of it, Abraham trusted God even through the pain of the loss of his wife. So you might wonder, well, how in the world does what we just read show us that Abraham is trusting in God? Remember the two promises that God gave Abraham. One was for a son, the other was for a land to call his own. Abraham's son Isaac is now with them, and he had been living in the region of Beersheba for a while now. But we read that Sarah died in Hebron. But when the author of Genesis writes about Hebron, he points out a couple of times, this is in the land of the Canaanites, not the land of the Hebrew people. It wasn't that she was going to be buried back in the land where she was from. With Abraham seeking land in which to bury his wife, what we see is that Abraham has a hope and trust in God that this land, while he may have always felt like he was just passing through, this land that he was now in would become the land of his family, and that is why he sought to make a claim on it. He trusted that his children, because of God's grace, would remain in the land. You see, in ancient cultures, and I'm talking very old cultures, where somebody was buried, that was how a family could claim the land. This wasn't a Hebrew thing. This was for the entire region for thousands and thousands of years, even before Abraham. People would set up their land claim in perpetuity by burying a loved one in the land. Oftentimes, they were buried in the living space. So in other words, you would have your loved one buried in your living room. One of my favorite research papers I had to write in seminary was in my archaeology class. I had to write about the funeral practices during the Chalcolithic period. So yeah, that sounds thrilling, right? I've never even heard of the Chalcolithic period at that point. That's a fancy way of saying the Copper Age, which was about 2,000 years before Abraham. And what they found were all these people that lived in the land of Israel, where Abraham was, 2,000 years before Abraham. There was this whole culture that existed at the time, and they were making all kinds of things out of copper, hence the Copper Age or Chalcolithic era. And what's very strange is that they all just kind of disappeared at once. Their homes weren't trashed. There wasn't all widespread destruction or anything like that. It was like everybody was just like, we're done, we're going to move on. Or it was Ancient Aliens, if you listen to the right shows. But all of these people all at once just vanish. But what is interesting is when you study what these people would do as a funeral practice, it's fascinating to see how 2,000 years later, Abraham is practicing some of these same things. What would happen is after somebody was buried, what they would do is they would throw your body in a pit. It sounds nice. And they would wait for animals to come along and eat everything. And so that all that was left were your bones. And what they would then do is they would take the main bones. Who cares about the however many 3? We have 3 bones in our ears, right? They don't care about that. They would take things like the skull and the femur and the humerus, the spine. They would take the major bones and then they would put them in a jar and bury them in the floor of the home. And this was done so that if anyone ever questioned whether or not you owned the house, or if you were some type of ancient squatter, all you had to do is go to this site because it's right there that you buried Grandma Lucille. And so you would just dig up her jar, and even though it's just bones, you'd be like, look, Grandma Lucille, this is my house, type of thing. So because they didn't have paper, they didn't have a legal system in the same sense. These are things we don't think about because we're so used to our culture. But how do you have a land claim before that? Well, we show that we've been here for generations and generations. So in essence, they're connecting their past with their present and their future. Now, why in the world do I go into all of that? Partly because that stuff fascinates me. Like, I love the cultural aspect of Scripture. But really, it's to show that Abraham was making a claim, a legal claim to the land for his offspring, and that this was being done in a very public fashion. Like, the fact that this, you might remember me saying before how legal proceedings would happen at the gate of the city. And you read here that this was at the gate. So this is a legal proceeding. And it's a way of publicly declaring something. Not like, a weird way of doing it, like Michael Scott declaring bankruptcy. I'm talking about a legally binding way in which those in the area would know for years and years and years, this is the land now of Abraham's family. This is a legal right that he has now. And even though, or even after the loss of his wife, who he really loved, Abraham was able to show trust in God through his pain. He knew that his family would be on this land for generations to come. So what happened is Abraham was able to trust in God for his present hurt and future loss because God is faithful. Abraham was able to trust in God, and that's evidenced by him making this claim to the land. Yes, my wife is dead, but we now have the land. So he was not being presumptuous. In faith, Abraham bought the land, taking nothing from the people, though they were offering it to him. It is important that when these people were burying their dead, it was being done. Abraham was burying his wife in a non-native land. There was no going back now. Abraham is saying, this is where we are. I am no longer an alien. I am no longer a stranger among the people. I am now a part of this land. And this took 100 years of his life to finally see that promise fulfilled. So this is when land truly does become the land of the Israelites, was at the death of his wife, Sarah. For us, what and who do we look to when we are dealing with pain and loss? Does the pain that you experience in life, does it cause you to turn inward and depend upon your own perceived power or your experiences or your own abilities or your desires? Or does it bring you to a further trust in God, knowing that though you are hurting, God is with you in the pain? Abraham was hurting, but he was still trusting in the only one who could help him in that pain. Remember, Abraham had everything as far as the world was concerned. Abraham had money and riches. He had servants. He had prestige and the respect of those around him. You read that where they call him a prince. Like, this guy was highly respected by everybody who lived around him. And even though he had a family now, and yet it was God's presence and promise is what he was holding on to the tightest. This is my land because God promised me it. And even though my wife has just died, I know that through that pain, he's setting up my future generations to be able to make a claim on this land. Like, I'm not trying to be a downer here. But there comes a time when you are going to be all alone. And you're going to be laying there in a bed with no education to turn to, no friends or family because they had to go home for the night, no one who understands what you're experiencing. You cannot rely any longer on your money when you're laying in that bed. You cannot rely on your job at that point. Your reputation means nothing because you're laying there in a gown with your backside wide open. No parents, no children, no pets, no one and nothing that you can trust in, except for your God, who not only made you, but who knows you better than yourself, who for those who have surrendered to him, who lives inside of you. And in those moments, what does our God say? Trust in me. Hope in me. Know that I will be with you through your pain. You still have a future with him, no matter how bad your pain is right now in life. Don't listen to the lies of the enemy or the lies of your own thinking. God is with us. We celebrate that every Christmas. God is with us, and we can trust in him through every pain we face, because we know that our very futures, our forever future, is with him. And we know now that even though Moses hasn't been introduced and there is no such thing as a Sabbath rest or anything like that, we now know that we are promised, those who follow Christ, we are promised a Sabbath rest that we will enter into after we're laying there in a hospital bed all by ourselves. God promises us, no, you don't understand what you're about to receive. You're about to enter into my rest, my Sabbath rest. The point is that God's promise to those who have faith in him, those promises do not end with our death. They're just beginning. Remember, that's one of the main points of this message, of this story. God's promise was fulfilled by death. It took the death of Sarah to see the promise fulfilled. Because God can do far much more, even more than what he has done in our lives. He can do even more through the death of his loved ones. So, we can trust in God for our present pain. And secondly, we can trust in God for our present provision. 16 again. Then Abraham rose and bowed down to the Hittites, the people of the land. He said to them, if you are willing for me to bury my dead, listen to me and ask Ephron, son of Zohar, on my behalf, to give me the cane of Machpelah that belongs to him. It is at the end of his field. Let him give it to me in your presence for the full price as burial property. Ephron was sitting among the Hittites. He was there. He was at the gate. So in the hearing of the Hittites, he came to the gate of the city. Ephron the Hittite answered Abraham, no, my lord, listen to me. I give you the field, and I give you the cave that is in it. I give it to you in the sight of my people. Bury your dead. Abraham bowed down. Again, he's going through a lot of things. He's in pain. Yet you see his faith being lived out in showing respect to people, even though he's in his own pain. Abraham bowed down to the people of the land and said to Ephron in the hearing of the people of the land, listen to me, if you please. Let me pay the price of the field. Accept it from me, and let me bury my dead there. Ephron answered Abraham and said to him, my lord, listen to me, land worth 400 shekels of silver. What is that between you and me? Bury your dead. Abraham agreed with Ephron, and Abraham weighed out to Ephron the silver that he had agreed to in the hearing of the Hittites, 400 standard shekels of silver. This is a standard way of what's it called? When you're negotiation. This is a standard negotiation in ancient practices, where you can picture this Ephron guy who's like, nah, just have it. And Abraham's, no, I'll pay for you. Nah, it's $400, but yeah, just have it. And the standard protocol is not to receive it for free, that you pay for what it's worth. So a little bit about this cave. A little bit about this cave that Sarah was buried in. According to Josephus, the 1st century, he identifies at that time the site of Machpelah with the area that is still known today. There's a mosque that has been built over it in the town of Hebron. And it remains, when it was first built, here, that's a picture of it. When it was first built, it was built by by one of the Herods. It was one of his building projects. So like around the time of Jesus was when parts of that were being built. It was then turned into a Byzantine church, and it was then turned into a mosque as time went on. But that is, today, you can go to what's known as the Cave of the Patriarchs, and you can visit this site. I have a series of photos here. Here's a picture of the inside of it. That is known as the Tomb of Isaac. And the Tomb of Abraham is right next to it, right there. And so what happens is, this is the sick part of it. Watch things that are going on in the Middle East. You can kind of start to see why both sides hate each other. As an Israelite, as a Jewish person, you're only allowed to go in there for like 10 days a year because it's a mosque. And that only came about, even though it was a mosque, from about 600 AD on. That change where Israelites are allowed to go in there only started in the 1980s. That for all the rest of time, if you were a Jewish person, you were not allowed in that mosque, even though it's accepted that that is where Abraham, the Muslims look to Abraham as the father of their faith as well. So this is a very holy site for Islam. It's obviously a holy site for Israelites. So what ended up happening is, here's a cross section. It's probably really hard to see. The bottom is a top-down view, and this is a cross cut of the view. So you have the entrance, and here's like Isaac's tent that I showed the picture of, and then it comes out, and there's other, because Abraham and Sarah, Isaac and Rebekah, Jacob and Leah were all buried here. Rachel was not buried here because even though she was the one that Jacob loved the most of his 4 wives, we'll get to that later, Rachel died somewhere else, and so she's not buried here. It was Leah who gave the most children to Jacob. So all of this stuff underneath is what's cut off. Isaac and Abraham are not actually buried there. We know that. That's not what they did in ancient times. If you go down a set of steps, you go into a corridor, and then there's a hole right here in this lamp room that goes into 2 other caves. Now, all of that has been sealed off. Unfortunately, in a lot of faiths, they're afraid of being found out that they might be lying or something, and so they don't let you inspect and study things like they should. And it's been under Muslim control now for 1,500 years. So they never let anyone in to study it. Now, here's the report. In 1967, the Israelites, they had been a nation now for about 20 years. They're fighting for the Gaza Strip. You know, that the stuff that we still hear in the news today. They get control of the Gaza Strip. And one of the first things they did is they marched on this site and had a celebration there. They took control of it from the Arabs that were living there. What they had to do, they opened up a site, and there's the steps that I showed you going down into the corridor. When they went to the end of the steps, there was a hole. So what they did, one of the higher-ups with the Israeli government had a 12-year-old daughter that they lowered, I don't know if you can see at the bottom, you can see her head and her hands. They lowered her into this hole so that she could give a study of what was down there. She was the first human to go down into these other caves in like thousands of years. I would love to do that. That would be so awesome. So here's her report. She's now a professor at Tel Aviv University. She's a English professor, but in 1967 she was 12 years old. She was interviewed a little bit later in life, and this is what she said. My mother asked me if I would agree to a small hole leading into a cave. After I agreed, she told me that it was to be the cave, or the underground cave of Machpelah. A few hours later, my father woke me. I dressed and went into the car. In the car, I wrapped myself on all around it. Like they were doing this under the cover of night because there were battles all over the place. I must have looked like a bundle dumped in the back seat. We set off and reached Hebron. We stopped for a while at the police station, and we then went on to the building of the cave of Machpelah. I got out of the car, still covered in a blanket, and went into the mosque. I then saw the opening through which I was taken. It was measured and found to be exactly 11 inches in diameter. That's how much space she had. Ropes were tied around me. I was given a torch and matches so that I could test the air. If the match wouldn't light, then you know there's not enough air to breathe and you needed to get out of there. She was lowered down. I landed on a heap of papers and money bills. Like people were just either dumping their garbage or they were like praying and, putting money down there. I found myself in a square room. I don't know if I can go back or not. I found myself in a square room. Opposite me were 3 tombstones, the middle one higher and more decorated than the other 2. There was a small square opening in the wall opposite me. They released more rope, and I went through the opening, and I found myself walking through a low, narrow corridor whose walls were cut out of the rock. The corridor had the shape of a box. Its corners were right-angled. At the end of the corridor was a stairwell, and the steps ended in a built wall. I was drawn through the aperture. That's, in case you're on Jeopardy, aperture, fancy word for hole. Recounted all that I had seen and went down again. I measured the narrow corridor. It was 34 paces long. When I counted the stairs, there were 15 when I went up, but 16 when I went down. I counted them again, going up and down 5 times, and the results were the same. The rise of each step was 10 inches. I went up the steps the 6th time and knocked on the ceiling. I received answering knocks in return, and they pulled me back. And I went down again and photographed the square room, the tombstones, the corridor, and the staircase. That's the picture you have of the staircase. I went up again, got a pencil and paper, returned below, and made sketches. I measured the room. It was 6 paces by 5. The width of each tombstone was 1 pace, and the space between the tombstones was also 1 pace. The width of the corridor was 1 pace, and its height was about 1 meter. I was pulled back up. On the way, I dropped the torch, so I went back down for it and was dropped up again. All right. You can look up pictures of what the room was like, but 12-year-olds don't take good pictures, and especially in a cave with a torchlight. Like you can imagine, it just looks like a brown mess. Like they're not a very good picture. But something to understand about the significance of all this is that once more, these are real places. This is a true faith that we have. They're not make-believe stories. These are real people that you can go and visit their tombs. So, something else that's interesting. Why was she buried at Mamre instead of Hebron, where she died? It's about a 1.5 miles distance from where she died to where Abraham wanted to bury her. It was in the place, it was at Mamre, where Sarah probably had some of her happiest memories. Because if you go back and read through Genesis, you see that the promise that God gave that she would become a mother, guess where that happened? At Mamre. The promise that Abraham and Sarah would have that land happened at that place. So you get this picture that it was a site that was important for Sarah, and so that's why Abraham wanted her to be buried in that cave, in that particular location. So by, again, locating the burial site here, Abraham is allowing it to serve as a reminder that God is the one who provided the provision. God is who provided the promise. God is who provided the fulfillment of the promise. And so when family would come back to visit, or even thousands of years later, as thousands of people would go to Abraham and Sarah and Isaac and Rebekah and Jacob and Leah, where they are all buried in that cave. Joseph, remember, his bones were picked up in Egypt 400 years later and brought to this cave and buried there. All of their tombs are located there, and when people visit, they are reminded that it is God who provided the land. It was God who provided the opportunity for His people to remain in the land even to today. So again, that helps us understand why the land is such a big deal in that country. But understand something. It was Abraham's riches or his reputation that bought the land. King Abimelech said it. He said it's clear that God is with Abraham, and that God has blessed Abraham with everything that he has, even the ability to purchase this plot of land and the cave. When we begin to understand that everything we have in this life came to us after first passing through the hands of God, through the hands of our loving Father, it can help us then have a greater trust in Him throughout our lives. Everything we have was first His. And even though we now hold it, it is still His. All of our blessings, all of our struggles, all of our joy, all our pain, all our suffering, our gains, our losses, everything we have comes to us through His hands, for He alone knows what we need. Jesus tells us this in Matthew 6:8, that our Father knows the things we need even before we ask. He knows our needs, and He alone is the one who meets our needs. And all people alive in this world, all people who have ever lived, we do so by the hand of God and by His grace. When Paul was writing to the Corinthian church, explaining why he was called an apostle, even though he persecuted the church and did not walk with Christ during Christ's ministry, Paul writes this. He says, "But by the grace of God I am what I am. And His grace toward me was not in vain." Can we get to a place where we can write or say, as Paul did, that everything he has, everything he is, it's there by the grace of God? The blessings, the shipwrecks, the joys, the thorns, in all the things we face, can we trust in God that He provided it? Can we live knowing God, as Abraham knew Him, as Yahweh Yireh, a lesson that he learned last week when he was sacrificing Isaac? God will provide. We can trust in God through our pain. We can trust in His provision. And finally, here's for all the people that I forgot. Everything we have first passed through the hands of our loving Father in heaven. Hurry up, write it. 3, 2, 1, there we go. And lastly, trusting in God in His promise. Genesis 23, 17 to 20. So Ephron's field at Machpelah near Mamre, the field with its cave and all the trees anywhere within the boundaries of the field became Abraham's possession in the sight of all the Hittites who came to the gate of his city. After this, Abraham buried his wife Sarah in the cave of the field of Machpelah, near Mamre, that is Canaan. The field with its cave. We see clear fulfillment of God's promise here now. That even in loss, faithful. Abraham now has a legal claim to the land. After the events of Abimelech, you see, Abimelech said to Abraham, go ahead, live wherever you want to, but Abraham still was not in possession of the land. Now, it took the death of his beloved wife to finally see that fulfillment of the promise that was made. How many times have we heard people say that God works in mysterious ways? Abraham likely was not expecting the death of his wife to be the event that brought about the fulfillment of God's promises to him. But what this scene does is it helps highlight a major theme that will be important throughout all of Scripture. That theme is that death is tempered by hope. Abraham's actions here to secure a burial plot, obviously that's a sad thing, but it also ensures that there is no doubt about his ownership of this particular site in Canaan. And so as a result of this agreement, the burial site can continue to be used by his family. And so we see all of his children and grandchildren being buried in this place, even to the point of death. These particular people, they lived in hope and assurance of God that He would keep His promise. And by leading Abraham to purchase the cave, God has already started to make good on His promise to give him now this promised land that He promised 80 years before that. So even in something like death, we can see how we can trust in God through our pain. We can trust in God for His provision, and we can trust that He will fulfill His promises. Will you please pray with me? Heavenly Father, we do pray that we would be able to trust in You in all things and through every way that You would call us to. God, in our pain, in our success, in our joys, in our sadness, times of gain, times of loss, Lord, we pray that we would be able to trust in You through it all. That we would be able to give You our pain. That we would be able to see the ways in which Your faithfulness in every situation in our lives. We would see Your many promises being fulfilled. Whether it's through the events of a bad thing happening or a blessing in some way. Lord, help us to see how You are faithful through it all. We pray that we would be a people who trust in You and look to You for all things. We ask these things in Your name, Jesus. Amen. Will you please stand?